We have beaten the Fallout 76 raid. 5 encounters across 5 bosses, 1 puzzle room, and a gauntlet-style challenge. We beat the raid. But was it good? What do we think about it? How does it stand up against other raids in other games? And first of all, I think we need to talk about our expectation for the raid. Where does it sit inside what we thought we were going to get? Now, if you look at Fallout 76's other endgame content, like daily ops and expeditions, we really didn't think much going into this. Daily ops are very simple. There's not a lot to them, very quick. And expeditions is a jump up from a daily op, but again, not a lot to it. So we kind of thought raids would be a very similar thing. Multiple very basic encounters. And we were actually pleasantly surprised. They were basic encounters, nowhere near as basic as we thought they were going to be. But I also don't think they're as good as what a Fallout raid could be. And we'll get onto that a little bit later. Encounter 1 starts you off in a giant round room with a mechanism in the middle. As you approach and trigger the encounter, the mechanism triggers and a giant boss arises from the middle of the room. The one thing this raid continuously nails is the visual. The spectacle of this raid is fantastic. It fits with Fallout 76, but it also just really makes a visual effort to impress you. And I think it really nailed that. Encounter 1 consisted of 2 phases. You shoot the boss's shield generator, and when you bring that down to 0, you can then do damage to the boss. There is then a point where the boss will do a room-wide AoE, killing everyone, and you need to make sure that you reach a security door and get the whole party inside the door before the AoE goes off. If you don't get in the door before the AoE, everyone dies. There is also sections after this where the boss starts doing slightly more mechanics, and the boss can also destroy large sections of the room that you're stood on. If it's bollards you're hiding behind, if it's gangways you're walking along, walkways and staircases up to the gangway. And I thought that was a really cool aspect of this boss, but he never seemed to do enough damage to really affect the room all that much. I never had an issue, so I would actually like to see the amount of damage the boss does to the room upped a little bit to start causing the player some actual issues, where for us it was a non-issue. Also, the amount of damage the boss was doing in a single shot was extremely high, and how the death mechanic works in the raid is once you're dead for the encounter. In Destiny, every player has 1 revive token, and if a player is on the floor, a countdown starts which will wipe the raid. So you have to pick a player up within that specific time frame. And I don't think that entire system would work in Fallout, but I think every player having a res token of some sort where you've got to use a stim pack but you can get them up once could be a good idea, because if you mess something up very early on and your friends complete the fight, you are out for the whole thing and you didn't see or participate. And it feels cheap for the person that didn't get to participate. If you want that mechanic, it's absolutely fine at a higher difficulty level. I feel like the difficulty of the first encounter is not in the execution of the mechanics, because there were very little in the way of mechanics. It was just shoot the energy generator, shoot the boss, get in the room, get back out, shoot the boss, don't get hit. I don't think that's interesting. I feel like to improve this encounter, you need to be making it a little bit more engaging instead of just hold left click. And how you would do that is by using the room mechanic that you need to enter the rooms before the AoE goes off, decrease the boss's amount of damage done, and add in another threat. So in this case, it would be some ads. Some enemies come into the room, you kill the enemies, you loot a key off the enemy, and then you trigger a switch with the key C. You've got to open up room C. Everyone gets into the room, the AoE goes off. And then it adds in a little bit more engagement to the encounter, where you're not just holding left click. You're engaging on an ad wave. That can be split off to another person. You're finding a key. You're opening a door. And it's not a lot. It's not a lot added to the encounter, don't get me wrong. But it's a little bit more engaging. And I think that's what this encounter needed to be improved. One of the biggest issues with this boss and the raid in general is melee. We had a stealth build, which was me. I knew it wasn't going to work. 2 power armor boys, and a melee focused build. And the melee focused build was useless for a large majority of the raid. This encounter, you could not damage the boss as melee. When the boss became damageable, our melee jumped on top of the boss and would start to damage him and then instantly die. And there was no ads for them to help with. There was no other mechanic that they needed to participate with. They just had to hide because they couldn't do anything. And to have a major build in the game, because melee is a major thing in Fallout 76, completely negated is awful. If you give the players a choice in a build, be it stealth, be it melee, you need to think about how those builds interact with the game you are making. Stealth I will give a pass to. It would be absolutely ridiculous if stealth worked inside a boss room mechanic. And if stealth doesn't work, then this stealth VATS build still dishes out a massive amount of damage. So I will give them a pass for that. But melee, a literal primary damage type in Fallout 76 just not working is unexcusable and is a massive black mark on this raid. The other thing with the damage for Encounter 1 is we were all using Blooded. From our research into Fallout and the last month of playing, Blooded is a primary perk that is used by a large number of people, and the amount of damage the boss was dealing did mean we were insta-dying. You could put the amount of damage the boss was dealing down to the Blooded perk. Blooded is a very high risk versus reward mechanic, and if you want to take that risk in a boss encounter, then that's on you, and I think that's fair. So moving on to the second encounter, we had a big drill that we needed to refill. Some team members had to defend the drill, kill the ads before they killed the drill, and other team members had to go and run and get gas canisters to refuel the drill. One of the big mechanics from here is the stalkers. There was unkillable stalkers in the tunnels where you would collect the fuel tanks, and they would one-shot you. They were quite slow, so they were very easy to run away from, but they would one-shot you. And I do actually really enjoy this, like, consistent, persistent threat. So these stalkers that were dotted around the tunnels were a really, really nice added element to it. And generally, I think the encounter was quite good. You had runners, you had refills, you had stalkers, you had wave defense. Generally, a reasonable encounter. There would be one thing I would improve on it though. If you picked up a fuel canister, you would slowly start to gain a debuff that led to you being slowed in some form. Like if you had 25 stacks of this buff, you were slowed. And then you had to drop a fuel canister to degrade the number of stacks of this buff you had. And the reason I think this is good is because it stops one person or two people from doing all the running. You really have to have the whole team engage in all the mechanics of the encounter to complete the encounter. So I would have it where one person goes running, grabs a fuel tank, comes back, refills part of the drill, and then they can't go back into the tunnels, because if they did, they would get up to 25 stacks of the debuff and be slowed, and that would lead to them dying to the stalkers. So what you would have to do is take it in turns to run, and while you were doing some wave defense, your debuff would slowly drop, and you would be okay to then run again when it's your turn. And a little bit of balance would be required, but generally I feel like that would make the encounter just a little bit more engaging and getting more of the team involved in the encounter itself. But generally, I think this was quite a good encounter. You go from a boss to a gauntlet run. Going down to the third encounter, you refill the drill. The drill drills a giant hole in the ground, and you would go down to the third encounter, which was another boss encounter, which had 3 bosses to it. You had 3 bosses in a main room, and then you had 3 side rooms with generators, and you couldn't damage the bosses until you had killed all 3 generators. Then the boss's shields would drop and you could do damage to them. The issue was that repair bots would come and repair the generators, and then the shields would come back up and you could no longer damage the bosses. Nothing about this raid was hard to figure out, but this was quite nice. I liked the balancing between bosses, generators, and repair bots. You had to make sure that you were engaging the repair bots before they hit the generators. Everyone had to make sure they were doing their generator, as well as balancing that with a good amount of damage on the bosses. There is one glaring issue though. It was insanely easy. One of our members died instantly. It had no impact on our completion of the encounter at all. How would I fix this? How would I make it harder? The bosses to me had two issues. One, their AI. Their pathing was awful. I would keep the bosses to the main room, so you had to leave the generator room to engage with the bosses. So how we did it, we would just sat on top of the generators and shot the robots. And then the bosses would come into the room, into the generator rooms, and we would just beat down on the bosses. If the bosses didn't come into the generator rooms, we would have to leave the generator rooms, exposing them to be repaired, to then do damage. Or we would have to have split the team up to say, you go generators and you deal boss damage. So that we'd have a defending team for the generators against the repair bots, and we'd have a damage team for the bosses themselves. And you could then balance out your team. But the fact the bosses would just walk into the generator rooms meant you could melt down the bots and then just melt down the boss. And it became very, very easy. The other thing is the bosses didn't seem like bosses to me. They just felt like standard NPCs, standard enemies, but with more health. They didn't do much more. I would have liked it if they buffed each other, where they all stuck to the main room, and one of them was a healer, and one of them was a shield guy, and one of them was a main damage dealer. And then you would really have to pick and choose. The shielder would give massive damage resistance to someone. The healer would keep healing his other allies. The damage guy, you would have to watch out because he was going to melt you down. And I feel like that could have been a really nice trio effect where it was you fighting a team instead of you just fighting an NPC. And for me, that would have made a big difference in how the encounter felt instead of how the encounter actually played out. But generally, quite a good encounter, if not extremely easy. Next, we move on to the fourth encounter, and an encounter type that I have never ever seen in another game. You had a room, a laboratory full of crystals, and enemies you couldn't damage would spawn. And it became a horde of bugs and beetles and deathclaws and mirelurks. Thematically, it really was this infested ultrasight horde hunting you down. And you couldn't damage them. The only way of damaging this horde was to blow the crystals up when the horde was next to them. And then that would do damage, and eventually the bugs would die, and then the health bar of the horde would drop down. So generally a really interesting idea of having to survive, run away, make sure you're not directly engaging a horde of enemies, while baiting this mindless horde into specific areas to then do a lot of damage to them. I really kind of liked this idea. The issue was the number of crystals was limited, which isn't an issue on its own and actually adds to the intrigue of the encounter, where you can't just blow crystals up willy-nilly. You have to make sure when you blow up the crystal, it's causing enough of an effect on enough of the horde to be useful, and you really need to be efficient with blowing up crystals. So I like the fact there's a finite number of crystals. I think that's a really, really good added point to the fight. It becomes an issue where it's easier to do this encounter solo than it is to do it as a 4-man. When you have a group of 4, you split the horde up into 4 components following 4 different people. And then you have those 4 people shooting crystals, and you can get through this encounter like this without a problem. Sure, you go around as a group, a bit of communication, blow the crystals up together, not a problem. That's harder than you just getting the guy in power armor to walk around the map and you be his eyes and ears, which is what we did. We all die, you in the power armor, walk around, have the whole horde follow one person, and that one person just shoots the crystals in the right time, does enough damage, kills everyone. Done. How would I improve this encounter to counter this way of playing it? And I would add a puzzle element to it. I would say reduce the number of crystals by 2/3 or 3/4. Very, very, finite numbers of crystals. And you then have a couple of people that need to lead the horde away. Do the main mechanic, destroy the crystals, kill the horde. And then you have two other people have to solve a puzzle, like a code puzzle or whatever, that randomly generates, and to spawn more crystals. And what you would have is if the guys who are being chased by the horde don't do their job properly, don't tag enemies, that kind of thing, then the horde is going to kill, in this case, the scientist team. And if the scientist team don't do their job properly and spawn more crystals in, the people who are being chased by the horde are going to eventually die. And it adds this layer of teamwork into the encounter. You can't just have the majority of your team die and one person complete the encounter because it's the path of least resistance. You actually need to have people in the encounter engaging with mechanics. And that's how I think I would try and resolve the issues with the encounter. Props to Fallout devs, because this is not an encounter I've seen in any other raid. And I think it shows their willingness to really try new things. And I think that's fantastic. But generally, yeah, they did have some issues. Then we lead on to the final encounter. The big boy, the badass, the big snake. This boss looked incredible. It really did. There is one major issue right off the bat. Every encounter up to this point, you walk into the encounter, you press the button, it triggers the encounter to start. This boss is a proximity trigger. I much prefer proximity triggers. I feel that adds in that sense of suspense when you walk into an encounter room and you don't know when it's going to trigger, what's going to happen, when's it going to pop out. I think it's a lot more engaging than just pressing a button. But you need to make sure that each encounter and the way an encounter is triggered is consistent throughout the whole entire raid. If you're going to do buttons, all of them need to be buttons. And the reason is, at this point, we had been trained by the game to think that we were going to hit a button. So when one of our party members walked into the arena thinking they would need to press a button, it triggered the fight, and everyone else missed the initial rise of the snake out of this toxic waste. And yes, we saw it again, and it is very, very cool, but there's a level of disappointment about missing the first time, and that's a bit of a disappointment to me. It's an issue that could have easily been removed from the game if they just kept the triggers across all the encounters exactly the same. So this giant snake arises from toxic waste. It looks incredible. The model work is fantastic once again, but then we come into a big point of contention. You can't melee the boss. So once again, one of our team members is absolutely useless, and it is down to 3 people to do enough damage before enrage. This boss has 5 attacks. The boss will do a poison spit that tracks onto each player and leaves a poison puddle on the floor. And if you walk over that poison puddle, you'll be poisoned. If you get hit by the spit, you will be poisoned. And this poison hurts. It really hurts. There is a big spit that tracks onto a single player. There is a triple shout, pushes the players off the platform. You can counter this by jumping at the same time as the shout, and you won't get pushed away. So that's nice. Adds a little bit more of the mechanical execution to the fight. Really, really nice. Then there are tails that will appear out of the toxic waste, and you need to kill the tail before it does a slam on the floor. The slam on the floor is obviously quite deadly. As well as this, though, it will destroy part of the platform, leaving you less room to maneuver. So really nice little quick kill the tail kind of thing. And then the boss also will do a lunge attack, and geysers across the arena will then spew out toxic waste and deal damage to you. So 5 mechanics that are generally pretty good. The primary issue, though, is the repetition of this encounter. It's probably one of the longer encounters. It took us a while to figure a few things out, not mechanically, but actually how to counter the mechanics. Poison is a massive factor. So we had to go into our builds and rejig them to counter poison using legendary perks. So that the poison became a lot less of an issue, and it was just a case of if you get hit by poison, stim up, make sure you don't die, and keep going. And at the time, I really hated the fact the game was making me dismantle my build to counter a mechanic. But actually, I've changed my mind on this. This is the hardest content in Fallout 76. And I think the fact the game says, hey, if you want to beat this, you need to understand how builds work. You need to understand mechanics. You need to understand buffs and debuffs. You need to understand legendary perks, which ones do what to be able to beat this. You need to have a really good knowledge base for this video game to be able to beat this boss. And if you don't, the poison will just wreck you. If you don't know the legendary perks and you don't know that one of the legendary perks decreases poison damage, you are going to severely struggle with this boss. And over time, I think that's actually quite good. Part of the wall of this boss is not mechanical execution, but actually game knowledge. In Destiny, part of the wall for a day one raid is not execution so much. Part of the wall in Destiny for a day one raid is game knowledge, is how to squeeze out as much damage from your class and your team as humanly possible. And if you don't have the game knowledge to squeeze out that damage, you're not going to beat the raid. And it's very similar in the final encounter of Fallout 76. If you don't have the game knowledge to counter a damage type, you're not going to do it. And I do kind of like that. I think that's good. But I also think it needs to be communicated well. Symbols to say, hey, you've got poison on you, that kind of thing. Because if you didn't know what was killing you, it could be misconstrued as just, oh, the game boss is doing insane amounts of damage, it's shit. Well, actually, that's not the case. The boss is doing poison damage to you, and you need to counter that. The boss will also go back into the toxic swamp and pop up somewhere else around the arena. So it's not an attack per se, but it is something you have to pay attention to. Communication with your team. Oh, he's gone left. Oh, he's gone right. That kind of thing. To make sure you're keeping the damage up. To make sure you know where attacks are coming from. And then once you do enough damage to the boss, you finally hit a enrage timer where the boss will slam down onto the arena. This is where a melee character actually becomes useful and is able to damage the boss. A tail pops up out of the toxic ooze and you have to kill the boss in time, otherwise everyone will wipe. Generally, I'm really glad there's an enrage in the boss. I love an enrage. I love trying to leak out as much damage as possible. We sort of hit the enrage once and then we're like, right, okay, let's pop this buff, let's pop this buff, let's make sure we're using this buff, let's make sure we've got our books on and all this sort of stuff to really maximize our damage output to get through the enrage encounter. So I really like that. I think that's a great added mechanic. I was glad melee could actually do something. And we went through going in completely blind. We beat the raid and genuinely it was fine. It was fine. I don't think this raid is anything outstanding. I really don't. One of the issues was bugs in the raid. We had a few bugs, as this game is prone to so many. The leader of the group crashed at one point, I believe. This led to the instance being split in two. So when you get disconnected from the raid, you've got to jump back into the location where the raid is. You've then got to walk through the entire raid down to the checkpoint where your team is. I wish it just teleported you to where your team is. It seems like a lot of wasted time having to walk back through the whole entire raid. It's not very long, but it is irritating. When the leader of the team crashed, he jumped in, walked down to the bottom. We got onto the platform with the main boss, and we didn't see him, and he didn't see us. And we were actually in two different instances of the raid. It wasn't a different world because we were in the same team as him. It was literally two instances of the raid. Though we were in the same team, if you're a leader, you start a new instance, which seems crazy to me. We were using Fallout First for better latency. I'll talk about more of that in my main video. But that was very unusual. So we all had to disconnect from the game, reconnect to their world, jump back into their team, and then jump back into the raid, and it was absolutely fine. But it was a very unusual bug to run into. The other bug we had in the final encounter was the boss completely going invisible. Not disappearing, we could still damage it, which led us to not dishing out as much damage. For a start, we didn't know the boss was there. And when we figured out the boss was there, obviously hitting an invisible target is slightly harder than not hitting an invisible target. So we hit an enrage and everyone died. So the boss just completely going invisible is a pretty big issue. And due to how this game is, with the bugs in this game, I don't think these are going to be fixed. I have zero faith that these kind of issues are going to be resolved, which sucks, which really sucks. So mind out, because when you go into this raid, if you ever jump into this raid, you may have some major bugs. The other issues we had were sort of just Fallout issues in general. VATS being a pain in the ass to use. But by far the biggest issue is that melee didn't work on a number of bosses. It's completely ridiculous to me to think that, hey, a major damage type just doesn't work. But I've talked about that. It is a massive black mark against this raid. and against the game in general, if I'm honest. Hey, you like melee? Screw you. That's how it feels like. The devs intentionally went out their way to nerf one of the best melee weapons in the game, which needed a nerf, to be fair, for that to be useless in the main content update for that patch. And that's the Fallout raid. That is the encounters, what I think could be improved, the issues I have with it. Genuinely, it was a fine time, but overall, no. I do not advise jumping into Fallout 76 for this raid. I don't think the raid is good enough to warrant playing Fallout 76. But there's a caveat to that. There's a caveat. And that is, if you enjoy Fallout 76, you will probably love this raid. If you are already playing Fallout 76, if you're already having a great time, this is a fantastic addition to the game. It is not an addition that is going to attract Destiny players and other raiders, but it is a great addition to the fan base of Fallout 76. I think it's a really nice jump in difficulty for Fallout 76. I don't think it's hard. In fact, this raid is incredibly easy, but it's the hardest content in the game. It really is two different opinions. If you're a Fallout 76 fan, you'll love it. I really believe that. If you don't play Fallout 76, there's no point playing it because you're not going to enjoy this raid. It's not good compared to other things that are out there. And then we get on to my final point, which was if I had to design a Fallout raid, I would have done this very differently. And that's because Fallout, and I talked about this in one of my earlier videos, Fallout has a special thing to it. Fallout has a way of designing quest lines that no other game can do, that no other game does. A way of reading through documentation to figure out a code for a door, finding a key to a secret pathway to get into the back of a closet, or if your lockpicking's high enough, you could just lockpick the closet. Interacting with objects around buildings to progress quest lines with hints and clues. And I think that's how I would have designed a Fallout raid. I would have gone into a boss encounter with clues around the arena and given the player like a safe room where they had to go into the boss arena, find a clue, run back to the safe room, inspect it. Oh, this has got a number 1 on it. Oh, this has got a number 4 on it. Have another player run across the boss arena, go up an elevator, type in a code that these clues linked to then remove a blast shield from the boss to give the players 20 seconds of damage uptime. Will survive while this was all going on, surviving maybe a number of ads or boss mechanics in some way. Remove HUD elements. Don't tell the player, oh, go over here, go over to the elevator. Say a bit of paper on the wall that says, remember to close the blast shield in the main office. And that's how I would have designed a Fallout raid. I would have designed a Fallout raid to be the best kind of Fallout quest Fallout could have. So I do think they missed an opportunity here. I feel like they made a bad Destiny raid in a Fallout game instead of making a Fallout raid in a Fallout game. Generally, I won't be coming back to Fallout. And thanks for joining today, and I'll see you again next time.